everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is my top 5 apocalyptic books. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books, and today I thought we would talk about some of the way too many books I have already read, and today I wanted to focus on apocalyptic books. So I feel like I'm very much entering a phase of wanting to read all of the post-apocalyptic, apocalyptic, dystopian fiction I can lay my hands on again. And I've recently read a couple that disappointed me, so I wanted to not talk about those, but to talk about 5 of my absolute favourite apocalyptic books. And I'm calling it apocalyptic because I seem to prefer books where the apocalypse actually takes place within the book. Some of these definitely do deal with post-apocalyptic times as well, or instead of, but I would say that my top type of post-apocalyptic fiction is one where the apocalypse is kind of happening within the book. And yeah, I have some really good ones to talk about today. I probably should have called this 6 of the best, because there are actually 6 books that I want to talk about today. Also, I would love you to give me all of your post-apocalyptic, apocalyptic, dystopian recommendations if you don't see them here. I do have a few on my TBR. I've definitely been sourcing more lately, and I think I am entering a phase of reading them. Yes, I've been a big fan of post-apocalyptic, apocalyptic fiction for a while. I went through a big phase of reading loads of them, maybe getting on for 10 years ago now, might be a little bit less than that, but yeah, read some brilliant books. I've always found the idea of apocalypse absolutely terrifying, so it makes very little sense to anybody, least of all myself, that I love apocalyptic fiction so much. And I actually find apocalyptic fiction quite comforting, or I have done in the past, because I think it just makes me feel better about like the times we live in now, because they are usually not as bad as what is happening in the books. But I suppose I haven't read as much apocalyptic fiction since we had the pandemic, which felt very apocalyptic at times. So yeah, that has kind of slowed down my apocalyptic reading, but I feel like I'm now back to wanting to read them again. So without any further waffle or ado, let's get into my top 5. Well, top 6. Let's get into the book that didn't quite make the cut of the top 5. It's not quite in the top 5, not because it isn't one of the 5 best post-apocalyptic books, but because this one is very much post-apocalyptic and happening at a time quite a remove after the apocalypse has happened. So in that way it is different to the rest of the books on this pile, and that is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This is justifiably a classic in the sort of post-apocalyptic genre. This one is interesting because rather than a zombie apocalypse, we have a kind of a vampire apocalypse, although to me this did read very much like a zombie book. And in the Will Smith film of the same name, as far as I can remember, it seemed very zombie film-ish, not so much as being about vampires. So yeah, the blurb here says Robert Neville is the last living man on Earth, but he is not alone. Every other man, woman and child on the planet has become a vampire, and they are hungry for Neville's blood. By day he is the hunter, stalking the undead through the ruins of civilization. By night he barricades himself in his home and prays for dawn. How long can one man survive like this? Very much enjoyed reading this. It was very different to the film, and yeah, it works both as a vampire novel and as a novel about living after the end of the world. I highly recommend I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, even though it maybe doesn't quite fall into the apocalypse like the rest of these do. So in at number 5, and starting my list proper, is How I Live Now by Meg Rossoff. And this one I would say is more of a coming of age book than certainly than any of the others. And this is about 15-year-old Daisy. Her mother has died and she has been sent to England for the summer to live with her cousins, I think it is. But while she is staying with her cousins for the summer, some sort of unidentified apocalyptic type event happens in this book. As far as I can remember, we never quite find out exactly what kind of event has happened, but certainly things change in the countryside. The children are left on their own to fend for themselves somewhat. This is a really good YA book. I would highly recommend this, but I would recommend this to a very different readership than I would recommend the rest of the books on this pile to. So read this if you like coming of age drama, and if you like sort of books narrated by teenagers. If you're also interested in apocalyptic books set in the English countryside, I do recommend this one as well. It is a really enjoyable read. Next up, we have another absolute classic of the genre in at number 4, The Day of the Triffids. I would say this is John Wyndham's most famous book, correct me if I'm wrong, and it was previously the only John Wyndham I had actually read up until last week when I finished The Kraken Wakes, which does not favourably compare. So this is a really interesting apocalyptic book written in the 50s, and it centres around some dangerous plants called Triffids that appear and start to cause things to go very, very wrong in society. I really enjoyed the opening of this. I would say The Walking Dead is very reminiscent of the starting point of this. It has that classic zombie film waking up in hospital type of trope in this. What has actually happened in this one is that our protagonist Bill has had an eye operation. Triffids already exist at the beginning of the book, but just sort of haven't had this apocalyptic time to take over. So we join Bill right at the opening of the apocalypse, and Bill is in hospital because he has had to have something done to his eyes, I think because of a Triffid sting, and as a result he is blindfolded at the time at which a lot of the other patients in the hospital watch like a spectacular meteor shower or something like that. So the day after that meteor shower, he discovers that nobody is there to help him have his bandages off or anything like that because the world has become blind. And in this world of blind people, there are of course a few survivors like Bill who have not seen the meteor shower. So it really does centre quite a lot around them and around those that have gone blind and what happens with them. Very apocalyptic. Absolutely brilliant book. I think this is the one on the list that I've read probably the most recently. I think I read this last year. Yeah, as an absolute classic of the apocalyptic genre, I would highly recommend this. I really enjoyed following Bill through quite a large portion of Apocalypse. So yeah, great apocalyptic book. Next up, I don't actually have a copy of, and you will ask, how can this be in your top 5 apocalyptic books but you haven't read the sequels? So this is the one to go for if you want to read a trilogy of books. I have not yet read the trilogy as my caveat, so I thought that this book worked amazingly as a standalone book, and I very much look forward to reading actually the 2 sequels. So this is Justin Cronin's The Passage. The book I actually have in my hands is The 12, which is the second in the trilogy, and the third book in the trilogy was called City of Mirrors. So I have not yet read The 12, so I can't tell you anything about that one. But The Passage, I read quite a long time ago, but I remember it being just an absolute giant tome of an apocalypse book. So this one follows various people, both like I think before, during and after this apocalypse has taken place, or is in the process of taking place. Very hazy on the details, but I would highly highly recommend that book if you are after a nice chunky apocalypse book to sink your teeth into. I think this one has sort of elements of zombie type things in it, and it also, I think there's some sort of like chosen one antidote sort of trope to this one as well, but I am quite foggy on the details. I think I need to reread that before I read the 12, but I cannot find my copy. I highly recommend The Passage despite the fact I do not have it to hand. And let's move on to the top two. My top two apocalypse books are like real favourites, very much so, even more so than the others, I would say. And in at number 2 is Station 11 by Emily St John Mandel. I know people who read this like as we sort of started the pandemic, going into that first lockdown, and I don't think that this would be a good book for that. I also think if you don't want to read pandemic fiction, although this was written a long time before our particular pandemic, I wouldn't recommend this, because I think the apocalyptic event in the beginning of this is like a flu type virus that brings down a lot of the population. There are several strands to Station 11 by Emily St John Mandel, and I am desperate to get to more of her work because I thought this was absolutely amazing. Not only is this a good sort of dystopian post-apocalyptic, it also does a really good job of the apocalypse itself. So we jump between a storyline that takes place at the actual time of the apocalypse. We have another storyline that is kind of later on, many years later, following different characters who are in a Shakespeare group that puts on Shakespeare plays to prevent them from being lost. And yeah, in a very post-apocalyptic society. And all of this is connected together throughout the threads by I think it was a graphic novel called Station 11, who one of the key characters wrote this, and all of the characters sort of have a connection to that graphic novel or comic. And I thought that was really well done. I always like a book where the threads are joined by some form of literature, and this one was. So I do highly recommend Station 11 as a great apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic book. My absolute top favourite apocalypse book. I actually have two of this author's books in my hands. I did choose between them, but I do want to mention the other one. This is also a very good apocalypse book, but I didn't pick to put it in this top 5 because it was by the same author as one of the others. The other one is more amazing to me because I've reread it twice within the space of a couple of years, and it's an absolute all-time favourite. One of the best things about this runner-up book that I didn't include in this top 5 is that it is partially narrated by a dog. So this is The Last Dog on Earth by Adrian J. Walker. I've recommended this one before, and it's partly told by Lineker the dog, and it's partly told by his owner Reginald. And this is a sort of story that follows them trying to make a journey. They live in a post-apocalyptic London, and there's a sort of journey storyline. It's a really good story, but this one's very much post-apocalyptic, whereas Adrian J. Walker's other novel that I really love takes place as the apocalypse is about to happen. So I've picked that one as my favourite. So in the early days of my channel, I think I spoke about this book quite a fair bit, and there's definitely a recommendations video which I will link, one of my earliest videos where I did recommend this one, and it's The End of the World Running Club by Adrian J. Walker. There has since been a sequel to this one, which I didn't like very much because of reasons, but The End of the World Running Club is my favourite apocalypse book because it is a first-person narrative. It's told by Edgar, who is a somewhat unlikable character because he is very aware of his own flaws, and there is we do see his growth over the course of this book. So he's not a very good husband, he's not a very good father, but this book follows him nonetheless, and you can't help but start to like Edgar, in my opinion. We join Ed during the apocalypse, as the apocalypse takes place. It's unclear exactly what has happened in the UK in this one. Ed lives in Scotland with his wife and children, and it follows them as they manage to survive the initial sort of apocalyptic time, and it then follows Ed as he has to try to reunite with his wife and family following another event. So yeah, without going into any spoilers of the End of the World Running Club, this is definitely, for me, one of the best sort of surviving the apocalypse type books that you can get hold of. It's not a zombie apocalypse, but the post-apocalyptic world is full of threats, full of the juxtaposition of normality with this new normality that is settling over the UK. So yeah, I just think that this is a great book about the end of the world, and I would encourage everybody to read this. Yeah, I think it's a great book. I couldn't help but root for Ed as he kind of founds the End of the World Running Club. So yeah, this one really gripped me. It's very thrillerish and also very apocalyptic. All of the 5 books I've mentioned in this top 5 are real favourites of the apocalyptic genre, or they touch on apocalypse. I hope I've given you some apocalyptic food for thought, and I would love to hear from you. What are the best apocalyptic books you've read, or post-apocalyptic? Dystopian's fine. Give me a shout of any of those in the comments down below. Let me know if you've read any of these 5 or 6 books, or whether you would like to. If you have enjoyed this video today, please do give it a like, and I would love it if you would consider subscribing if you haven't already. And I will hope to see you all again very soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.